Welcome to Keep Your Thrive Alive. I'm Mark Mulligan, and this is the place where I share inspiration, tips and techniques to help boost your mood, your energy and your well-being. Today I'm delighted to have John Binns with me. John enjoyed a long and successful career in the professional services sector. He was a partner in Deloitte and he continues to work with them and many other businesses as an independent mental health and personal resilience advisor. He gives one-to-one coaching support to over 200 business professionals across the UK. He's Vice Chair, Board Member and Trustee of the leading UK mental health charity Mind and on the board of the City Mental Health Alliance. He was awarded an MBE in recognition of his services to mental health. He is one of the bravest people I've ever met. I'm delighted to have you here, John.
Well, first of all, thank you for those kind words, Mark. And I guess my interest in mental health and well-being and things to do with it came out of my own experience of when I was a Deloitte Partner, getting into a bad place myself and actually getting into a place where, given the way that I was feeling, given the way that I was functioning, in a way that was almost unrecognisable to myself as how I would normally be, I kind of thought that would be it for me in the professional services world. And it was really a reflection on the fact that those thoughts that I wouldn't be able to go back and do what I'd done before were not true. And actually the fact that I was able to go back into the business and have 7 more years as a successful partner, subject to the same kind of commercial pressures that I'd had before that inverted breakdown. It was by reflecting on what had gone well in that experience and what hadn't that I suppose set me off on the trail that I've followed since.
Could you tell us maybe a little bit more about what was the personal impact for you of all of that?
As I began to get into a place which I now know to be stress-related heightened anxiety, tipping into depression, there was a period of about a year building up to an absolute point where one night I just recognised, you know what, I simply can't face going into work the next day. So it led up to one night where that was it, just couldn't go on.
And whenever I talk about you, I always say like you're one of the bravest people I've ever met. And for me, it's because when you came back to work and you were better after your breakdown, rather than brushing it under the carpet and not talking about it, you actually came out in the sort of way that people often talk about other ways of coming out. Yeah. And were like big and bold and brave and told people about it.
I mean, I suppose when I look back at it, you know, I guess it was in some ways, but it didn't really feel so at the time. It kind of felt like actually a feeling that there were probably many other people who had felt like I was to some degree, not necessarily getting into the same place, and an absolute passion that we should probably talk about this stuff. And if we talked about this kind of stuff, then the need to be brave would disappear. It was very clear to me that there was something I could do about it, given the position I was in.
For me, when I'm coaching people, I notice that there are certain things, that sort of themes that come up. As an example, a couple of years ago, I was coaching 22 people who had just been promoted up to director level. And one of the things that was fascinating for me was that 16 of these people wanted to work on the same thing, which was personal confidence. So I'm just wondering, from your perspective, what are the sort of things that come up that you see?
Well, it's really interesting you say that, Mark, because the word that I would put on what you've just described to me is something which we are beginning to hear about now more, which is something called imposter syndrome. Well, I suppose the best way to think about it is a belief that maybe I, the person, has got to where they are with a degree of luck, followed by, and I'll get found out.
So, like, how common a thing is this?
It's really rife. Yeah. I mean, I see it time and time again.
And are there any particular groups that are more likely to be affected by this?
In particular, it tends to be groups of people who are underrepresented at the leadership level within the organisation that they're in.
So women, maybe people from certain ethnic minorities,
Absolutely.
People with certain sexual orientations.
Yeah, where you don't see the leadership reflecting the way you are, that will tend to compound it.
So what's the negative impact of imposter syndrome for individuals?
It's a bit like feeling you're walking a tightrope and at any point you're about to fall off. Yeah. And if you think about what that must feel like, the rest kind of follows. It's tiring physically, it's tiring mentally, it's wearing emotionally. And for many people, it then forces them to either leave or to start to have issues of effectiveness within the workplace.
And does this lead to mental health issues as well?
When I come across imposter syndrome, it's because it is very, 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 very frequently the key belief that they hold, which has been contributing to what is becoming a mental health issue.
I've heard that some organisations in the city have an almost implicit policy of recruiting insecure overachievers. What do you think the impact for an organisation might be of doing that?
So because of this belief, they will often pedal 3 or 4 times as hard to prove to the world and themselves that they perhaps are more worthy than they feel. And of course, therefore, in a environment which is incentivizing people around performance and delivery, then you will get a lot out of that individual as a result. There's been perhaps a hidden cost associated with that behaviour that businesses are now beginning to realise.
What impact might it have on the culture of an organisation and ultimately the financial success?
A person suffering from imposter syndrome will tend to be more risk averse because they won't want to expose themselves to being found out. And if you have too many people who are operating with that kind of thought process, then what does that do? Well, it means that the whole organisation can become too risk averse, i.e. not as entrepreneurial as it could or should be. And therefore doesn't make some of the kind of positive gains that come from taking a more proportionate view of risk.
So what could you do about it? Do you have 3 or 4 tips that you could share with us?
First thing I'd say to someone in front of me would be to ask them who they admire. Now tell me 2 things that person isn't really very good at.
Okay.
And they will nearly always tell me a couple. And I'll say, but you have just told me that you really, really, really admire them and you really think they're great at their job. Why do you hold yourself out to such a level of perfection that you have to be able to do everything? So starting to kind of attack a sense of perfectionism, which often goes, I must be perfect. Starting to realise that typically the person is being much harsher to themselves than they would ever be to those around them. Actively look for points of similarity between yourself and those around you. Knowing that's a truth, knowing that our minds will tend to listen out for the conversation which says, everybody else actually in this organisation went to Oxford and Cambridge apart from me, and then actively listening for points of similarity. You can train yourself to hear them just by the choice to do it. And remember to give people praise for the things that they do. Don't assume they think they're good at it. They might be just like you, assuming they're not. And if that's the way you start to go about things within the business, then boy, does that build a connectivity.
And I guess when you begin to do that in the business, especially as a leader, you create a permission space for other people to do something similar. And so it becomes much more common for people to express the value that they perceive in other people.
And reflect that back to you. And I think it's a very good point.
Nice. So I think we mentioned 3 things already. What's a 4th thing?
I suppose the final thing, in a sense, that I'd leave you with on this would be to recognise that successful people ask for help. Asking for help is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength.
And also I think when you reach out and you ask somebody for help and you express that vulnerability in doing that, that there's something that's very endearing about that we connect with people through that vulnerability. I remember hearing this phrase once, that we respect our leaders for their capabilities, but we connect with them for their vulnerabilities.
That's a really good way of putting it.
So John, you've talked about what an individual can do, those 4 steps. What can leaders do to positively shift and change the culture?
Well, I think the key for a leader is to actually be prepared to show a little more vulnerability and to actually project the truth that a really good leader doesn't absolutely have to be bulletproof in all circumstances, and that showing a little bit of vulnerability will be good for them, is okay, and will be good for their team.
John, thank you so much for sharing your insight into imposter syndrome. I know I found it incredibly useful. I'm sure everybody watching will too.
No, thank you very much for inviting me, Mark, and it's been a really, really good and interesting conversation. So happy to have helped.
So you can find out more about how to be fit for success with John by visiting his website, which is www.johnbinns.weebly.com, or email him directly at jbinns@fitforsuccess.co. That's just .co at the end. So the key takeaways from this video are: lack of confidence and imposter syndrome affects 70% of people. It's much more common than you might have thought. For individuals, it can have a negative impact on mental well-being, relationships, and performance at work. For organizations, it can lead to suboptimal performance. The good news is that there are some simple techniques to help you develop confidence and vanish imposter syndrome. Show that you value others. Acknowledge and recognize their strengths. When you do this, it becomes contagious. Just like a nod or a smile at somebody, they begin to mirror it back. Thinking about who you admire. Are they perfect? Of course they're not. What is it that they're not good at? Actively look for areas of similarity between you and others, focusing on what it is that you have in common rather than the differences. And finally, ask for help. The most successful people recognize their imperfections and get the support that they need. If you're in a position of power, demonstrating that you are not all-knowing creates permission space for others to do the same. I hope you found this interview useful. Now I'd love to hear from you. What's the most useful thing about this video? What do you think would other people that you know, either professionally or in your personal life, benefit from? What is it that you are going to do? Please leave your comments in the section below. I'd love to hear from you. Now I look forward to seeing you next month, and in the meantime, be well and thrive.